It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
What's up? What's happening? Welcome in to Take Command, a podcast that is recorded on the internet, which is great. The internet's a wonderful place, but it can also be an awful place. And it's also sometimes a place that doesn't work great. And unfortunately, as if you're watching this on YouTube, you see I'm in the official Take Command hostage studio recording this special introduction. Probably get the sense that something perhaps went wrong along our journey today. Logan's internet was not cooperating for the back half of the podcast. And normally the software that we use covers for that in a way that's great and fantastic because technology is wonderful. And for some reason today, that didn't happen. The good news is the knowledge is still there and it mostly sounds fine. In fact, if we hadn't done this very silly little introduction, chances are you wouldn't have noticed outside of a blip or two, especially if you're listening. You're watching, the video's not going to be the greatest on Logan's side of the screen, but that's okay. You don't watch this to stare at our beautiful faces. You watch it for football information, and there is plenty of that. So we humbly ask you to just bear with us through this. And again, it mostly for the listening purposes will not make a lick of difference, but we did want to be human and transparent and acknowledge it, that even we cannot control the internet. And thus, here is today's edition of Take Command. Welcome into Take Command. I'm Craig Hoffman. He is Logan Paulsen on free agency Monday, week 2. Logan, what a week 1 it was. So much movement, trades, everything all around the league. We'll talk about kind of the around the league portion in a little bit. We'll also talk about where we are now looking ahead to the NFL draft after 1 week and the majority of the free agency movement done. There's obviously still plenty to go. But we start with the biggest move at the end of last week, the one that it's funny, man. We hypothesized like what's going to happen with Sam Howell at the end of the pod last time we recorded. And then hours later, barely had we gotten the thing out when, at least they waited for a little bit to get it out. But we see him shipped off to Seattle. The return is somewhere the equivalence of a third rounder, according to the Jimmy Johnson draft chart. Other draft charts have it as kind of a seventh rounder. I think the widest consensus charts are somewhere early to mid fourth rounder in return. But the hard facts are they upgrade a sixth to a fifth and a fourth to a third, and include the highest one being that 78th pick that they received from Seattle in return for their starting quarterback last year. Logan, and with that gigantic setup, what do you make of the deal for Washington?
Yeah, I mean, it was always going to be a little bit dicey when Marcus came in. And I think, we kind of alluded to some of that kind of like uncertainty, I think, in our last podcast, because he's a good player. He's got some ability, but, how do you handle that with Marcus on the roster? And you're probably going to draft a guy, maybe not at 2, but at somewhere in the draft that's going to be kind of the face of the franchise moving forward. And it just became a little weird. And I think they determined that he did have value still, and that the teams are going to be willing to give stuff for that. And I think in this retooling, rebuilding type of an environment, like draft picks are worth a lot of money, and especially if you have a guy here that, is a former 5th round pick you're not invested in, and there is value for him around the league, you might as well get it, and I think a lot of fans are probably disappointed, and I understand why, because they think you did see flashes and you did see some of his ability, but I think it's important to understand that this staff is not connected to him. So I think moving on, getting something in return makes a lot of sense to me. And again, like I'm not the biggest fan of moving on from really talented players or people that show they have ability at the quarterback position, because you can develop those guys and potentially trade them later. They just chose to do it now. And I think the other point to consider there with that perspective is that even though people can develop young talent, like how are they going to develop him here in this? If he's the third guy, he's going to be potential practice squad guy. You're going to lose him potentially. It just becomes way more complicated. So get the value while you got him. And, unfortunately, like he leaves, and I think he's a good football player, but, I think it's probably a better opportunity for Sam. So.
Yeah, there's no way he's getting to practice squad. You're not cutting him and then having him not claimed. So that's not possible. If you're going to keep him, he's going to have to be the third guy on the roster, presumably behind the number 2 pick and then Marcus Mariota. Or as we talked about last week, like maybe he does beat Mariota fairly and squarely, and he's QB2 / the starter if the number 2 pick isn't ready. And we went through all that, which we don't need to go through again because now it's irrelevant. But I do think that what we definitely see, or the last thing I'll say on the development point is, let's say he does develop, they find a way, and like in practice he's showing himself really, really well. No other team's going to know. What are they going to do? Take your word for it? Like, hey, do you guys want to give us a 3rd rounder for Howell? He's killing it in practice. Right. Like, that's not how this works. So there's no place to showcase that, unlike a defensive lineman getting rotational snaps. You're not putting Sam Howell out there for a half to be like, hey, everybody come trade for Sam. So there's no real way to display that. And thus his value probably is going to decrease from this point, sitting on the bench as the contract continues to toll. And you now get him 2 years left on his rookie deal if you're Seattle, which is why other teams, Denver and others reportedly were in on him. I think the other thing that fans have to kind of, and to a sense, like I think us as analysts have to try to parse out is, Sam did not get a fair shake in DC, without question. I think the play calling last year, we've talked about it, wasn't very good, did not set him up to succeed. There was no incubation of him as a young player. They put way too much on his plate, and it just felt unfair. And especially when you see the flashes like that, you're like, man, I think this guy could be a good player. But it's not Adam Peters' responsibility to find out how good Sam Howell is. It's his responsibility to do what's best for the Washington Commanders. And I think getting pick number 78 in this draft is without a doubt the best thing to do for the Washington Commanders compared to keeping a talented guy on your roster that has more value as a trade chip than he will to you in 2024.
I mean, I couldn't have said it better myself. Like, I think people want us, they want what's best for the individual. And I think like that is a little bit of a misnomer. And I think people don't understand how cutthroat this is. The NFL, like, it's not about how the staff develops you, it's how you develop yourself. And I think, like to your point, like it's not Adam Peters' responsibility to see how good Sam can be, and like I've played with a lot
and especially how good Sam Howell is for the Commanders. Like that's not the mission here.
Yeah.
It's how good can the Commanders be, and Sam can figure out how good he is somewhere else.
Yeah, 100%. And I've told this story before. You play with a lot of guys who are really talented, guys that, could potentially start given the right opportunity, but the chips don't fall kind of the way they should for that opportunity to come out. And then they get cut, they get traded, and no one knows about them. And I think like I look back on my own experience making the Commanders, the Redskins at the time, making that team in 2010, like it kind of had to fall the right way for me to even get an opportunity. And I think people don't understand that. And so for him to get that sustained success, like the chips didn't fall. And I think he's a big name. He's a notable name. But I think when you kind of take a step back and look at what the team has invested in him, look at what he did last year, like it makes sense to me that they would move on. And especially like in this draft where, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, where there's an opportunity for some trading of picks. Getting another 3rd round pick is very, very valuable this year, and having that opportunity to kind of package that or move that or use it to offset some cost. And it's a bonus pick. So it makes a lot of sense to me. And again, like even if you don't move it, there's going to be a good player there that's going to help your roster with that pick. So, good luck to Sam, and hopefully fans understand that it is a business. It is a business decision, and it's not what can you be? It's what have you done for me lately? And if you haven't shown me what I need to see, then I'm going to move on. And unfortunately, that's the nature of the deal with the NFL. So
the other thing I wonder about this too is it does feel like this group has done a good job of removing resistance and drama potentially. And this is not the fault of Sam remotely, but he does have a large following in the fan base. And there is an element of, and I don't know, like this is kind of more of, I'm setting up a premise here and I'm curious if you agree with it as someone who's been around the league. You were also someone who was a player, like tuned out noise. And even as an analyst, you're like, I don't care about that. And clearly that is not the consensus because even within different front offices, people care or not about narratives more or less, coaching staffs, ownership groups, etc. But clearly if either the number 2 pick struggled or Marcus struggled, there were going to be calls for Sam. If he wasn't playing, he was going to be, to use the vaunted word, a distraction. And it's just whether it's like there really is impact on or not. Now you don't have to deal with it. And to me, that seems smart. Like the what kind of juice is worth the squeeze there of like, oh, well, if everything goes haywire, we need to play him. He could maybe be good. Like that's the potential payoff versus this dude is kind of lingering over. And in the same way that they moved on from some other guys, where it just like wasn't a fit and the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. I kind of feel like getting this storyline out of town now is the right move for the organization to create a smoother path moving forward. That's me sitting in a talk radio chair. How do you see it from your chair?
No, I agree. I think that's entirely valid, and I think that's something that like I don't care about a lot of things, but I do care about that because it like you said, it does become a distraction. Like here's your potentially third string quarterback, and people are like, "Why isn't he active? What's going on with Sam?" It's like the coach does not have the bandwidth to be talking about that, especially when you have a guy at number 2. And like you said, let's say he struggles a little bit. And it's like, well, Sam, he's on the roster. Let's get him in there. And then every day they're asking, like in the locker room, they're talking to players. Oh, do you think Sam should start? Who do you think should start? Like, is Sam look good in practice? And it becomes a thing you don't need it. And again,
Right.
like when you're turning a new page, when there's an opportunity to do this, when there's an opportunity to get value in return, it's like, might as well move on. And I think a little bit of it, it's like, you look at these teams moving quarterbacks, like there's a reason they're doing that. Like Justin Fields has a huge fan following in Chicago. Kenny Pickett has a big fan following in Pittsburgh. It's like, just remove that distraction. Let them have an opportunity to succeed and blossom somewhere else. Because like we said, it's not our job. It's not my job as Adam Peters or Dan Quinn to maximize Sam. It's to maximize the Commanders. And if that is going to be an issue and fans are going to be talking about it, and even if players in the locker room are going to be talking about, hey, do you remember how good Sam was last year? That's not putting that number 2 overall pick or wherever they are picking in the best position to be successful. So that's something I keep coming back to. And it's not fair. It's not fair to Sam. It's not his fault. But I do think if you're trying to build a team and there is that kind of dissension in the locker room and in the media and in the fan base, now just remove it. We don't even have to talk about it. It's number 2, and no one is calling or hearkening for Marcus Mariota to be the starter when you got Drake May, Jaden Daniels, JJ McCarthy, name your guy, Bo Nix, whoever it is. Like everything's going to be kind of squared up. So,
Yeah. All right. Let's give those Howlers one last bite at the apple here, though. Sam goes to Seattle. Obviously, he showed so much. I think the way he carried himself was fantastic this past year. I thought at many times he was the best voice in the locker room / on the team at the podium. Like I like what he had to say, better than the head coach, better than the offensive coordinator, better than a lot of people in that locker room. I think he showed a leadership capability. I'll always go back to that video that we've definitely shared on the pod before, that the Commanders captured post-game Dallas after that infamous year 1 start, where Rivera has this look after Sam gives the speech in the locker room being like, wait, that's who that kid is? That's what I've had in this locker room the whole time? And like the leadership is just oozing out of him. And I think that he can do well in this league. Like I think his ceiling is somewhere in that 15 to 20 range, which is like a legitimate starter in the NFL. Obviously, your hope with the number 2 pick is that you get something much better than that. Hence, Adam Peters is making the right call here. But if you look at Sam Howell, having watched every snap of his on tape these past couple of years, and especially this past year when you were studying him to go over everything for the pod, as he was the starter, like where do you see Sam and his career going from here, starting this year, presumably as the number 2 to Geno Smith in Seattle?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the exact weeks, but it was like, I think it was early in the season. It was like Denver through probably 2 or 3 games. And he just looked like the dude, like all the things you're talking about from a quarterback, the big time throws, like just the composure, the leadership, like the moment never felt too big for him. And that's exciting, but I do think that it's important to know that like Aiden O'Connell showed something similar in Vegas this year. There were moments where he looked really good. And I think it's just about, I heard this thing on Move the Sticks podcast with Daniel Jeremiah and Bucky Books. I think I sent it to you, Craig, where they were talking about being patient with young athletes and letting them develop. And unfortunately, Sam was not afforded that opportunity. So now I'm kind of hoping that he is given an environment where they can be patient with him. He's the number 2. We'll have a lot of time to kind of sit, work, and develop. And then like I honestly could see him making a kind of like a reappearance at some point after an injury to kind of like be the next Geno Smith, like, 3-4 years down the road after kind of, again, because I think, like you said, the leadership, the charisma, all that stuff is valuable. And we got to see that. And then obviously the physical arm talent is also valuable. So I think in the best case scenario, like you said, probably that 15 to 20 range, he's got to work at it. He's got to develop. He's got to be in the right spot. Like lightning's kind of got to strike for that to happen. But I do think that's a possibility for him because I do think the physical skill set is there. So, good luck to him. Hopefully that happens because again, like you want success for these guys. You want them to make a lot of money, but there is a roadmap. If you squint and kind of look at the map in the right way, there is an opportunity for him to get there. And I just hope it happens for him.
Yeah, I mean, Gino's had a couple of injury issues over the past couple of years. Obviously, there's a new staff up in Seattle with McDonald and Ryan Grubb coming up from Alabama. So we'll see how that plays out. I don't think they've fully committed to Gino as their starter, and certainly as a guy in his 30s, on a deal they can move on from. If Sam comes out and has a terrific camp, terrific offseason, who knows what happens there for him. So he's certainly in a great spot, I think, too, with the receivers that he's got, the type of receivers that he likes to throw to. Jackson Smith and Jigba is a guy who can create separation and be college open, even in the NFL. DK is enormous and thus always open to an extent. Tyler Lockett, great deep threat. So there's a lot for him to play with up there in Seattle if he does get the opportunity. And I think, to your point, is he ever going to be the franchise guy who gets the franchise deal? Is he ever going to get even what Kirk just signed for? Probably not. But could he do kind of what Gino's done, where he makes really good money by any other standard, other standard other than NFL QB money or NBA player money, and is there, and thus that contract affords him to be the quarterback of a winning team? Yeah, absolutely, because you're saving $20 million on your quarterback. It's a little more invested in other places, and as long as he's happy to sit at that level, Sam Howell, I think can in the future win you football games. But when you have the number 2 pick, you are looking for that franchise guy. You are looking for someone who you think has Hall of Fame level of potential. And that is ultimately why they make this decision. But that doesn't mean Sam Howell's a bad football player. I think they made a good deal here. And thus onward we go into the rest of free agency, the rest of the Commanders' future without Sam Howell. Best of luck to Sam. And that's this, at least for now, Logan. Finally, once and for all, concludes our Sam Howell talk. Now going to take an opportunity to look around the rest of the NFL. There was 852 moves, Logan, that happened in free agency. Did you know that?
That seems like a made-up number because it is.
It's because it is. 100% I made that up. But it is nonstop the last couple of days, the last week, really since the tampering period opened, and so much movement around the league. It's funny because a couple of podcasts I listened to a day later, and I'm like, oh, you missed a ton of important stuff. It's funny. I listened this weekend to New Heights, the Kelsey Brothers podcast that was from Wednesday. And, what happened between Wednesday or Tuesday when they recorded and Sunday when I listened was an absolutely ridiculous amount of movement, but also what they covered on that podcast. There was so much. So we'll take a kind of a wide look real quick on some high level moves or some, in the division moves. And then there's kind of a theme that I think has started to develop that Logan and I want to dive into real quick. Then we'll wrap the podcast talking about kind of where the Commanders go towards the draft. But obviously Kirk Cousins, a name that a lot of people still pay attention to around here, and he's the biggest move of free agency. So quickly, what do you think of Kirk going to Atlanta, the fit, reuniting with Raheem Morris and some familiar faces down there with the Falcons?
When Kirk goes to Atlanta, I'm not surprised by that at all. It just seems like the most natural fit for him. I think, when you look at the playmakers, when you look at the offensive line, when you look at a defense that's young and kind of growing, it just is a classic Kirk move, I guess. A guy that's really well informed and really well researched in terms of his opportunity. His wife's from there. He's got family down there. It's perfect, and I think in that, and the other thing that's important, I think, is in that division, they are now a playoff contender just by him going there. And I think that's ultimately what he's looking for, is opportunities to make pushes in the playoffs with young, talented rosters. They still have pick 8. They're going to get a lot better with that. So to me, it just feels natural, that this is the opportunity he chooses. And they play in the dome. There's a lot of games down there in the dome. There's no bad weather football games. I know those are things he considered throughout. A lot of people had him going to Pittsburgh, and I was like, no way he goes to Pittsburgh, because that division's a nightmare and they play outside all the time. So I think he found kind of the perfect resting spot or perfect opportunity for him to go make a lot of money, obviously, and play good football. So
yeah, I think it's a great fit. I mean, he's got weapons, and his best attribute is to be a distributor. You don't necessarily want him to go have to make a bunch of plays, but if you need a guy who can reliably get weapons the football, Kirk Cousins is pretty darn good. At least Kirk Cousins pre-Achilles. We'll see. Obviously, that's a big what if in all of this. But assuming that he is healthy and assuming that he returns similar to the form he's had in Minnesota, get the ball to Kyle Pitts, get the ball to Bijan Robinson, get the ball to Drake London, like get the ball to those dudes. They added a couple more guys. I mean, they just traded for Rondale Moore, low key, phenomenal move. That dude's nasty. So like, they've also got some good players on defense that they brought in last year, guys like Jesse Bates. Let's say they used the 8th pick on a guy like Dallas Turner or an edge rusher, and all of a sudden they've got that with Raheem Morris, coordinating the defense. Like, that team could be pretty good. And if Kirk, this has always been my thing with Kirk going back to when he was here. If he can get hot at the right time, you can win a Super Bowl with him. Is he the first guy that I'd pick? Absolutely not. But could he Joe Flacco it? Could he just get stupid hot in the playoffs? And with the right team around him and some other things going right, could you win a Super Bowl with Kirk Cousins? Yeah, if that's the formula, it involves some amount of luck, but that's the formula and it's possible, and Atlanta's a great place for that. Speaking of Pittsburgh, Russell Wilson and Justin Fields now there. This is interesting because I think a lot of us think of Arthur Smith's offense as really benefiting from the quarterback run stuff, and clearly it has at times in the past. But I think a lot of NFL observers look at both Fields and Wilson as bad fits with him for kind of the type of thrower that he looks for, even if the quarterback run stuff is there. What do you make of those two guys? Russ is the starter, Fields is the backup, going to Arthur Smith.
Well, I think one of the reasons they say that is because, they have a hard time traditionally throwing the ball over the middle of the field. Like, obviously, Russell Wilson is this dynamic playmaker that's a little off schedule that, finds his throwing windows through his athleticism. And that's just not how Arthur, the offense and how, like, think of it, it's more like a Kyle Shanahan offense where it's like, here's a spot, let's throw it to the spot, here's your footwork, be on time, get the ball out. Like, that's not really who Russell Wilson is. And I think when you look at his time in New Orleans last year, I think he has the ability to get that kind of stuff done. But it's just not what he majors in. And same thing with in Denver. Sorry, yeah. Oh, I was thinking Sean Payton. That's why. But yeah, like, so in Denver. So obviously, like, he can do it, but it's just not like his forte. Same thing with Justin Fields. And so I think unless you're trying to, I've always been intrigued by Justin Fields to Arthur Smith because of how well they coached the run game in Atlanta, because they had essentially 5 first-round picks on the offensive line that were all really good, all really physical. They had dynamic backs, they had receivers that would block. So just adding that element basically turns you into like the single wing or triple option in high school football. And that's really hard to stop at any level. However, like, you don't want to be living in that full time. You need to be able to work play action off of it. You need to be able to find these opportunities down the field. And that's not what works for, Justin Fields and Russell Wilson traditionally. Now, I do think they can get there. I think Arthur Smith is a really good coach. I think he can be, from what I've heard and understand, can kind of difficult to deal with. But I think he's got a high standard. He knows how to get that offense communicated. And I think he can get them there. But I understand that kind of high level thought that, hey, like, we in Kyle Shanahan's offense, when Arthur Smith's offense is a version of that. It's his own version, but it's very, very similar. We run the football to set up play action. We stretch the defense horizontally. We attack the middle level of the defense. And, when you watch Russell Wilson, when you watch Justin Fields, that's not traditionally what they've been excellent at. So,
yeah, both guys have a ton of arm strength. Russ is one of the best deep ball throwers in the modern history of the league. So the idea that you can take shots down the field certainly seems like something you could do with Russell Wilson, but that timing and precision, and especially over the middle of the field, like that, Russ threw over the middle of the field less than any other quarterback in the league last year, and more than half less, if you will. So I think, like, just to get straight to it, like, Ritter was like 12.5% over the middle of the field, I think, in terms of distribution, and Russ was like 5%, I think, were the numbers. Right. So definitely different, but I also think that I think Pittsburgh's gonna be pretty freaking good. Like, you get competent QB play there with that defense and what they've had the last couple of years. They win 9 games a year no matter what, and now they got competent QB play and potentially electric QB play. So
yeah, I don't think it's a bad, like, I don't think it's bad. I just think it's like one of those things where it's like, is the fit supernatural? No, but I do think you have a guy in Russell Wilson who's played a lot of football, seen a lot of football. And I think when you look at, like, even your quarterback evaluation, like coming out of the draft, guys that have seen more stuff tend to be more effective in the NFL. And Russell Wilson's seen a lot of stuff. And so just about now, can Arthur Smith build an offense that speaks to his skill set? And can Russell be okay being a passenger on a team that, like you said, is very, very talented? They're going to get more talented because they've got him at, what is that? What is his contract value? Like 1.5 this year.
Yeah.
So they can add a whole bunch of free agents and build that team around him. And and they have some dynamic playmakers. So yeah, there's a great opportunity there for him to be pretty dynamic.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. All right, NFC East, definitely some interesting moves. Not really from the Cowboys. They have done basically nothing. They signed Kendricks, the linebacker who's in Minnesota and other places. I think it was most recently with the Chargers. But outside of Eric Kendricks, they haven't really done anything because they are not in a great salary cap place, and they are very much trying to make sure that they do not commit money long term so that they can redo Dak's deal potentially, but sign guys like Parsons, CeeDee Lamb coming up next year, over the next year. Philly, they did some stuff. Saquon Barkley is the highlight, but Bryce Huff comes in on the defensive side. And then the Giants obviously make the big trade for Brian Burns. They also sign a couple of interior offensive linemen. Anything you particularly like or dislike from the rest of the NFC East?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the Saquon pick is like really interesting, and like, how do they use him? I've heard a lot of people make the comparison, like they're just trying to keep up with the San Francisco 49ers. And I'm not sure I see that, and it's like, in the offense that they were running previously, like the back was kind of a passenger, right? The offensive line kind of, drove the car there, and the quarterback run game elevated the running back, and they can kind of put whoever they wanted in there. So I'm really curious to see what this looks like with Saquon back there. Like, do they kind of change their approach? Do they emphasize the running back more? Are they trying to deleverage Jalen Hurts? Like, what's going on? So that's something I think is really interesting. Obviously, Bryce Huff is a dynamic football player. I think he's got the highest pass rush winning percentage of any, he's top 3 behind like Myles Garrett and like Micah Parsons. So what's he look like with a bigger role? And I think that kind of fits, initially I wasn't sure how that would fit, but I think it fits with Philly's vision of just kind of being excellent across the defensive line and creating wins. And then you mentioned New York. I think the Brian Burns trade is really interesting. Like his value, how it's decreased over the last couple of years is interesting, but also I think the investment in interior offensive linemen, not only for the Giants, but across the NFL, has been pretty fascinating. So something, again, that we can talk about here more in a second, but just that whole process of kind of emphasizing interior offensive line play, obviously pass rushers are extremely valuable. And then running back, which is a position that isn't considered tremendously high value, especially for the Philadelphia Eagles. Getting some money there was kind of interesting, I thought.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that larger the larger picture piece you're talking about is actually, ironically enough, was something referenced by Ron Rivera, I think in his interview with Keim after he had gotten fired. And John asked him about Eugene Shen and like, hey, since Eugene came in, of course, the Commander's director of football analytics, I think is his title. Yeah. The analytics guy. He might be like a senior VP of I think it's senior VP of football strategy and analytics. Anyway, The point is, he's very smart. And he was around the Ravens organization for a long time, as well as some others. And Ron said that when he took over, when Ron took over, they were really focused on trying to build up the lines, the trenches, which is kind of this traditional method of like, we got to build inside out football team. And it's a very horizontal in terms of your layers. Like think about your defensive line, you go back a horizontal layer, and then it's your linebackers, and then you go back and it's your defensive backs, right? Your 3 layers of the defense. And when Shen got there, they're like, no, we're going to build through the spine. We're going to focus on going vertically, if you will, dividing the field inside and then out. And that has been, I think, a way to build successful football teams in this league for a long time. When you look a little bit deeper and kind of check your framing of things, you think about the San Francisco 49ers and what they've got on their D-line. Obviously, Fred Warner at linebacker, Tafunga, and some of the safeties they've had over the years have been hugely, hugely important to their success. Your tight ends become really important. You think of Kansas City, and Travis Kelce's kind of the centerpiece of their offense outside of the obvious of quarterback and Mahomes, but they built it. They chose Travis over Tyreek Hill because building through the center was more important to them. And so I think that when you look at the investment that, Carolina made in their offensive line, that New York made in their offensive line, and some of the money that's been spent in the middle of these teams, obviously the Commanders, Luvu, Wagner on the defensive side, they've already got Allen and Payne, but Jeremy Chin is a safety. Like a lot of teams have really focused on like how we got to be really solid through the middle. And I don't know the full reasoning. It'd be fun to talk to some folks who kind of come from this background and understand it a little bit more of the reasoning why behind this. But I think you are seeing some of the money start to flow that way, defensive tackles, interior offensive line, et cetera, versus some of the more traditional positions that have gotten a lot of money in the past.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's when you think about it, just kind of take a step back and think about it, it makes sense. Like I think when you think about building through your lines, I think obviously it's important to have good defensive line play. Like look at the Philadelphia Eagles, like they've kind of made that their mantra for the last 10 years, and they've always been pretty successful at that. I think there is value there, but the problem is you can't do that at the expense of the rest of the roster, and I think when you look at Washington, obviously they had 4 first round picks invested in the defensive line, but they had no depth behind them, right? So you were really like counting on that group to just maximize everybody else. But I think when you look at, again, you mentioned the 49ers, the Ravens, Detroit to a certain extent, they have a good piece at the linebacker spot. I think the problem with the linebacker and building through the spine, as you say, is finding linebackers. Like they're just not a lot of good ones, And so I feel like the Washington should be very grateful that they found Lou Vu, because I think he is a guy that's going to be very dynamic at the middle level of the defense. Obviously, Warner's one of the best linebackers. He's a Hall of Fame player at this point of his career. Like having that kind of influence there is really, really important, right? Because it changes how offenses attack you. I don't think it's an accident that like Arthur Smith, Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay, all of these West Coast derivatives are attacking the linebacker level of the defense, the linebacker strong safety level of the defense, because it's hard to find players that can fit the run and then drop into coverage and fill those roles. So it makes a lot of sense to me, in terms of kind of filling that out. I also think, we mentioned the guard thing. I think the guard thing is also really interesting because when you look at smaller quarterbacks, for example, you need depth to the pocket. When you look at old New Orleans Saints with Drew Brees, like they invested a ton of money in the guards so that the quarterback could see what the heck was going on. And I think that's what you see with Carolina. I think that's a big element of it. Also, I do think that if you look at this year's draft, there's a lot of tackles, right? And tackles traditionally are harder to find from like a body type standpoint. But I do think the importance of interior guard play is maximized, like you said, through like the Kansas City Chiefs. Like they made a big investment in center, both guard spots, and those guys have elevated Patrick Mahomes because they allow him to step up into the pocket and make plays and do the things that he does so well. So I think the guard thing is starting to make sense in terms of there's going to be a scarcity in terms of the draft. You need to prioritize that, especially for a smaller quarterback and Bryce Young. But the linebacker thing, I think, is also super interesting because everyone knows that's important. You just can't find guys consistently to get that done. Like that's why the Warners, the Luke Kuechly's are so special because they come along so infrequently.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Just because it's important doesn't mean that there's like you wind up having a supply and demand issue. Basically, is the short version of that. And the Commanders obviously get Wagner. It's not Bobby Wagner 5 or 10 years ago, but he's still real good. Led the NFL in tackles last year with 186. But you see what the difference a guy like he's made over the years. A guy like Warner, and we'll see some of these other players that have signed for decent deals around the league. What difference can Patrick Queen make in Pittsburgh, for instance? He's a really interesting case study. He got a lot better when Roquan Smith got to Baltimore and started calling the signals and getting everybody on the same page. So what is he in Pittsburgh without Roquan Smith there in Baltimore? All right, that's kind of our free agent roundup for around the league. The next part will start with a disclaimer. Wrapping up here on the Take Command podcast with Logan Paulson. I am Craig Hoffman. And Logan, I'm going to start this part of the podcast with a disclaimer. A listener discretion is advised, if you will. You ready for this?
Can't wait.
All right. We are going to talk about the possibilities that Washington has to make trades in the 2024 NFL Draft. I realize, because I read so many YouTube comments from all of you, that this is something that is very upsetting for a lot of you.
Is it really?
Why? Because there is a large and loud group of Commanders fans who have done their research. Logan, they've grinded the tape. What that means, I don't exactly know. I'm having trouble finding all 22, but apparently there's people who have enough time to comment on YouTube that have found it, and they are just professional scouts waiting. I should stop being so sassy. People have strong opinions, and that's what makes this job really fun. That the Commanders should take Jaden Daniels number 2 or Drake May number 2, and if they don't, then Adam Peters, despite what he just did in free agency that they absolutely love, should be fired, not just from his job, but in a spaceship into the sun. And so the idea of trading out of number 2 is completely off limits. Now, I will follow that disclaimer and say that we're going to talk about it anyway by saying I still think the most likely outcome is they just stay put at number 2. And if they love one of those quarterbacks as much as you, fan who is really upset about this possibility, does, then that's absolutely the right move. However, we don't know what Adam Peters and the Commanders scouting staff and coaches think of Jaden Daniels, what they think of Drake May. And thus, as people who talk about this for a living, it would be irresponsible not to discuss all the possibilities. And especially, I think, with someone like Logan, who has watched a ton of tape on these guys, talk about kind of where you're at and your thoughts on them. So with that disclaimer out of the way, the Minnesota Vikings made a trade with the Houston Texans. They acquired the 23rd pick from Houston in exchange for a second rounder this year and a second rounder next year. So they now hold 23-11 in this draft. The rumors are hot and heavy that they love Drake May. And in order to get Drake May, I think that they're going to have to trade with Washington at 2, because I do not think that trading up to 3. Now, obviously, if all of a sudden Washington takes Daniels, which would make some people very, very happy, and I certainly wouldn't mind. But if Washington takes Daniels and New England's on the clock at 3, could Minnesota pull that trade off then? Sure. But if they want to know going into draft day, Caleb's going to 1 to Chicago, we are going to get Drake May, they're going to have to blow Washington's doors off with a trade. That's the setup. That's the news that is triggering this conversation. I've now talked enough, Logan. What do you make of kind of the possibilities and how Minnesota is setting themselves up in the role that Washington plays in this?
Yeah, I've always been even in this draft, a pretty big advocate of trading back. And people say, oh, why? There's these 2 potentially generational type players there. And for me, I think when you look around the league and look around like the history of teams that win Super Bowls that don't have Tom Brady or Patrick Mahomes at the helm, they're really, really good, talented teams. And how do you get good, talented teams? You got to draft. And I think like one of the things I look at here is with so many holes on this roster in terms of talent, obviously they did a good job in free agency of filling out the roster and getting people that are very talented and are going to fill roles for a couple of years, but you need talented pieces long-term. And the way you do that is through the draft. And so I've always been a big advocate of acquiring more draft picks. People say, oh, I can hear the argument already. Like, well, you don't pass up on generational guys. And my question to you would be, how do you know that player is going to be generational? And if you do know, you're Nostradamus, because if you look at the history of quarterbacks being drafted in the first round, very rarely are they successful the way you think they should or are being successful. Now, they get pushed up draft boards because it's the most important position in football. But what I'm saying here is, if you are not in love with one of these players, like if you're not like going to bed dreaming about Drake May or dreaming about Jaden Daniels or JJ McCarthy every single night, and there's a little bit of doubt in your mind, why? And the difference between Drake May and JJ McCarthy in your mind as an evaluator is not that much. Trade back, get more opportunities to draft other players, get more draft capital where you can trade up, you can trade for assets, and then take JJ McCarthy and build a better team around JJ McCarthy through the draft. So I actually don't hate this. And I think it's a good way to mitigate risk. And people say, well, like if he's the next Patrick Mahomes, you should take him. Like, no shit. Yes, you should take him. He's the next Patrick Mahomes. You should obviously take him. But even if he's the next Josh Allen, like think about Josh Allen. Like he's been playing second fiddle to Patrick Mahomes for the last 2 years. Like you need a good team to beat the guy, right? You need a great team to beat the guy. And that's what I would say is this is the first foundational step that allows you to accelerate this process, build the roster out, get a guy that you feel like you can win some games with, and JJ McCarthy, hypothetically, maybe it's Bo Nix, whoever you want to put there. And then I think that's not a bad idea. You cannot tell me, if you've watched as much film as I have, that you know for certain that one of those 2 guys is going to hit. Like you just don't know. And so mitigate that, it can be successful. And I think that's ultimately the thing is like you want an environment where you can be patient, let that player develop. And how do you do that? You take stuff off their plate by having a better roster. And so I think that's where I feel so like this shouldn't be a bad thing. This shouldn't be like a bad news bears or bad news for the fans. Like this is a really unique opportunity to change your franchise dramatically. Now, especially if you don't love one of these guys at 2.
So the more I watch them, I don't want to say the less I like them, but the more I feel uncertain about it. Right. Because there's, I came out of the combine and, we're talking with Nate and we're talking with Trevor Sikkema. I was texting with Trevor over the weekend about this because he had done the double trade in one of his mocks post Super Bowl. And I was like, man, this Minnesota thing makes me think that maybe you were onto something there. And he's like, I can't for the life of me figure out why they wouldn't just take May at 2. He loves Drake May as a prospect.
Right.
I don't love Drake May as a prospect. I'd probably still take him number 2 because I just think you bet on the characteristics, you bet on the history, you bet on, kind of what you think works. And you're in some ways you're betting on yourself, right? You're betting on your own ability. And you've talked about this, I think, so well over the last month of us doing this and this draft stuff is ultimately the guy who goes to the best situation is going to be the one that works because most quarterbacks aren't scheme proof. Most quarterbacks aren't situation proof. And I certainly don't think Drake May and Jaden Daniels are. And I think either one of them, because I like this staff and I like this organization, could come here and succeed. But I also kind of think J.J. McCarthy could too. And so if that's the case, I would much rather trade back and get something extra and then maybe trade back up. And there's been one basically 3-team deal floating around where the Commanders wind up at 5. And, if you wind up with Marvin Harrison Jr. or Joe Alt because quarterbacks go 1 through 4 and you miss out, like, oh, darn, we got the best player in the draft outside of Caleb Williams, right? Like, that's not a bad thing, especially when you're thinking about building a roster for the future. And then, do you try to, at that point, trade back up into the end of the first round and get Nix or hope he falls? Or, like, you kind of got to, at this point, come out of the first 2 rounds with the quarterback. But at the end of the day, like, I just don't, it is about what you think of the prospects. Because, again, can't say this clearly enough. If you think May is that dude, or Daniels is that dude, or frankly, if McCarthy is that dude, you don't get cute with it. Let's say you think McCarthy's the guy. You're like, JJ McCarthy is a future Hall of Famer, and I don't get why he's not consensus QB2 in this draft. Then you take him at 2. You don't worry about trading back and if you think he's right, you go with your evaluation. But if you really don't have that high level of confidence and you think there's not that much of a difference between any of these guys, trading back is the right move. And this is the thing I said in January. It's the thing I'll continue to say all the way through April. And I just haven't seen enough on film yet to convince me that that's not the case. So if I'm being totally honest, that's where I am. I also admit that the amount of expertise and film study that I've done pales in comparison to the people that get paid, in Adam Peters' case, 7 figures to do this. But I think Minnesota is going to make you a pretty substantial offer to come up to 2. And I would listen to that. And if it's 23 and 11 and a first next year, I'm very interested in that. And especially because I don't know that Minnesota could be good with a rookie quarterback in O'Connell and, hey, man, just throw it to JJ and we'll be fine. But they also might not be. And you could be looking at an extra top 15 pick next year out of the Vikings in this trade. So there's just a lot, man, here to consider. And I'm glad we're having the conversation. And it is, I will say personally, it is reaffirming that you seem to be in a very similar place to me with kind of where these prospects are, despite, I think, how quarterback rich this draft seems.
Yeah, I mean, they all have their warts. We've talked about that a lot. Like when you watch, Drake May, I like him a lot. I like the way he throws the ball over the middle of the field. I like his playmaking kind of moxie. But then you watch his footwork and you watch him make decisions and you watch him work through reads sometimes. You're like, what's going on? Why'd you do that? And again, it kind of coincides with that inconsistency we've been talking about for a long time. And so, I think Fred Smoot and I were talking about this the other day, and we were like, who he reminds me of is Aaron Rodgers coming out of college. And Aaron Rodgers is awesome. And I know fans are really excited. But what did Aaron Rodgers get to do for 4 years coming out of college? He got to sit. He got to refine his mechanics, refine his process, understand. And so I think that's the kind of talent you're talking with. But is Aaron Rodgers the Aaron Rodgers we're talking about today? If he had to play week 1 for Green Bay, I don't think so. I think when you look at quarterbacks that are successful, the slower you can kind of let them marinate and let them come along, the better. And so that doesn't mean that they don't have to start week 1. But I think about teams like Joe Flacco with Baltimore or Ben Roethlisberger with the Steelers. You're able to run the football, play good defense, limit their exposure in terms of the challenging things they have to do. It's the same thing with Russell Wilson. That was a defensive-led team, with a heavy running game, and he just had to make plays. Same thing with Tom Brady. 100%. Great point. It's all like that, right?
Brady kind of won 3 rings before he had to do a whole lot.
And I think, and that we're not besmirching the great name of Tom Brady, but that's the fact. Of course not. Right?
He's still the GOAT, but he got there in part because he got a friendly launch.
And Patrick Mahomes, same thing. That was a running team first, and then it grew into what we see today, where he's kind of at the helm. So I think like that's the thing: is any one of these guys outside of Caleb Williams, like you put them in day one, and are they ready to go? I don't know, because I could make the argument that it's JJ McCarthy, because you look at his third and 7 percentage, it's the best of the bunch. Like he's throwing past the sticks, he's doing big time stuff, he's making NFL reads, but he's got like 100 throws on the year. You know what I'm saying? Like he wasn't asked to carry the team, right? We mentioned Drake May and his kind of inconsistent play at times, right? Then I look at Jaden Daniels, like one of the best deep ball throws in the class, explosive runner. He doesn't throw over the middle of the field with the same regularity as those other two guys. So those things give me pause. I don't think they're all good prospects. We'd be lucky to have any one of them, right? But if I can mitigate my risk, I might want to do that. Now, that takes a gigantic amount of courage to do that if you're Adam Peters, to basically say, to basically acknowledge I'm not that confident. Let's stockpile draft capital and let's let it roll. So I don't think that's going to happen, because it's such a bold move, and bold moves get people fired. But if you hit that right, it is a home run, and you've accelerated this process by a year and a half, and you're ready to rock and roll. So do I think there's validity to it? 1,000%. But also, to your point, if you think JJ McCarthy's the guy, or if you don't think there's that big of a difference, you don't mess around. You've got him at 2, take him at 2, move on, so.
Yeah, if you're going to do it, you have to be okay with getting none of them. And that is a pretty terrifying proposition. I will say, I think that Josh Harris doesn't care what people think. And that is really empowering for an executive. Like, Josh Harris has been the most hated, like, for as much as we love him here, that dude is the most hated guy in Philadelphia, which is silly because his basketball team has won 50 games every freaking year, something the Washington Wizards haven't done since 1979. But Wizards angst aside, like, he's got thick skin. And he's not going to, if he thinks Adam Peters is doing a good job, he doesn't care what the media at large thinks. And so I do think that is something to keep in mind here, that he will empower Adam to do what Adam thinks is best, bleep the narrative. But there is a very good chance that what he thinks is best is saying, let's take our guy at 2 because we can't mess around and we hope to never have this opportunity again. And then maybe they sit him. And that's the other part of this. Like, the other part about not caring about the narrative is you can sit your guy and say, like, yeah, the fans are pissed that Marcus Mariota's playing, but we don't care because this is best for us long term. And so again, to wrap kind of where I started at the end of the disclaimer portion, I still think that's the most likely option. Yeah, and I think it's the most likely option by a lot. But you're going to have to say no to a big time offer from Minnesota, I think, because of it's very obvious what they are doing. And if you believe the rumors that they, like Drake May, they're going to make you a gigantic offer because you also probably like Drake May quite a bit.
No, I totally agree. And I think it's just, again, like, what's your confidence level that that's the dude, and you don't know. You won't know until, and that's why that, it's so funny. I had to do a big board for the other show that I do, the Take Command podcast and Ticket to the Draft. And going through, you realize, like, every year when I do this exercise, I forget, and I should, probably should remember every year. This is the most subjective thing, right? There are certain things like this guy's a first round player, right? Because he's built this way, he runs this way, he plays this way, right? But as you get out of that top, like, 20, it's like, I like this guy a little bit more than this guy. And you're not wrong. Like, you're not wrong for saying that. And it's the same thing with these quarterbacks. It's like, people say, oh, I like Michael Penix. I like Michael Penix too, but I have my questions about him, right? And it's just who has the least amount of questions. And I think that's ultimately why this process is such a crapshoot, is because it's not scientific. And then people forget that it's about the landing spot, not only for quarterbacks, but for the player as well. And if it's not right, it's the player's not going to develop. So it's all of those factors put in together. It's not just the evaluation. It's not just the meetings. It's how they are insulated and how they're developed when they're here. Because if they're not developed, remember, every single position that you're evaluating in the draft is being projected to the NFL level. So if they don't maximize that projection, it's not going to happen. So I think that's so important for fans to remember about this process. It's not this guy's the best definitively. And there's levels to it, obviously, but it's so subjective, and landing spot is just as important.
Totally. Wrap with this. Charles Davis was on the show on Friday. He wants to connect with you, by the way. That's an off-air conversation. But
cool.
Charles Davis, NFL Network, was on the show, and I was asking him about the Howell trade because it had just went down. And I was like, a lot of people say this is a 90-ish player class, 90 to 100. So how important is getting that pick 78? And he's like, I don't know if it's that thin. I've got it more at 150. And we were talking it out. And I was like, the funny thing is, if you've got 90 and someone else has 90 and someone else has 90, by the time you do the Venn diagram, it's going to be about a 150 player draft because the 90 that each of you have is going to be a different one. And he's like, that is 100% correct. And so, again, it is so subjective. It is so dependent on landing spot. It's so dependent on coaching. They're so dependent on so many things. But it's really fun to talk about. And that's why we do it here on the Take Command podcast. And then we do mock drafts. I think we are going to do mock draft 4.0. I can't believe we're already at number 4, but a post free agency mock later in the week. We'll see if there's still gigantic holes in this roster. Like we might push that to next week, but definitely another pod this week. And then we will have a mock draft. I'm going to guarantee within the next 3 shows, but most likely later in the week. So make sure you're subscribed. If you like what we do, tell a friend. Go ahead and subscribe on YouTube as well. And we will see you later in the week on Take Command. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command, which has a brand new home.
That's right. You can watch on YouTube at the Team 980.
You can also listen to full episodes in the free Odyssey app, which is now enabled with Apple CarPlay. So we'll just, follow you around.